Throughout the 1990s and towards the turn of the new millennium, a new wave of indie and art house filmmakers emerged that were exploring extreme physical and psychological subject matters in new, interesting ways. In Europe, directors like Lars von Trier, Gaspar Noé and Claire Denis were rising to prominence with their provocative films, while in America, filmmakers like Todd Solondz were pushing the boundaries of taste and discomfort with movies like Happiness. But one American filmmaker in particular, called Darren Aronofsky, rose to prominence on the indie circuit with his debut film Pi, and was then able to push over into the mainstream, creating slick, high-end, Oscar-winning films with big stars. But despite becoming a mainstream household name, Aronofsky was able to retain that provocative art house sensibility, telling terrifying stories of obsession, addiction, and the destructive effects these can have on the human mind and body. Join me as we continue exploring the mind and body, and we discuss two disturbing Aronofsky classics, Requiem for a Dream and Black Swan. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in our Mind and Body series, and this is part 20, in which, as that intro suggested, we're going to be looking at two movies from one of the great auteurs of the 21st century, Darren Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream from 2000 and Black Swan from 2010. These will, of course, both be spoilerific reviews, so please do check them both out. I know a lot of you have already mentioned that you will never, ever, ever sit through Requiem for a Dream a second time. That's fair enough, but I do think it's a film everybody should try and check out at least once, because it's really something. It's not a film you're likely to forget. So we've got lots to cover this week. Let's get straight into it. Joining me to discuss all things Aronofsky, I've got a brand new guest. Very excited to have him here. He is a writer, a video essayist, a programmer, a journalist, a whole bunch of stuff. I'll let him tell you a little bit more about that. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the podcast Leigh Singer. Hello.
Hello, Mike. Thank you very much for having me. Great to be on the show.
Thank you so much for being here. First of all, just for people who don't know anything about you, Leigh, tell me a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do.
Okay, so, I guess I do a variety of film-related things. I don't know what the collective noun for a bunch of film stuff is, an outtake of, I don't know. But, I started as a writer, so I still write for various magazines, websites, publications. Mm-hmm. I also do programming, program advising for the London Film Festival and other festivals. I do some teaching, but I guess the main thing I've sort of moved into in the last few years is video essays. So basically, for people who don't know what that is, that's kind of audio-visual criticism and analysis. So, instead of writing a piece about, a filmmaker or a film or a scene or whatever it is, you kind of, use the film itself and make a short video that, usually ends up on YouTube, Vimeo, something like that. So that's the sort of thing I guess I'm probably doing. That's taking up the majority of my sort of working time at the moment. And, it's something I enjoy. And I know something you do too. So, I think it's the future.
It is. It's so good. I love it, honestly. And you were quite an inspiration to me in getting into these sorts of video essays, because I really like all the stuff that you do. And as somebody who's not much of a writer, I don't really enjoy writing. I get very impatient with writing. But I love editing. I love video editing. I love talking. So I was like, this is, video essays kind of feel like they are a little bit more fun for me and a little bit more accessible, and also kind of interesting. I think when you're talking about films and visual mediums, in some ways, I think it fits better than a written piece a lot of the time,
Don't tell all our writer friends this.
I know.
No, I mean, what you say. Firstly, thank you so much. That's lovely to hear. It's one of those things that I'd been writing for a while, and if I'm honest, I was getting a little bit jaded with it. And then when this kind of sort of kicked off, and I was very fortunate to get a bit of help at the beginning and people supporting my work, it totally reinvigorated my own sort of engagement with, you know, film criticism and journalism and reviewing and all that kind of stuff. And what you said is true. It's like, you know, for me, I won't go into a long spiel, but basically when you're working with a film and you're editing with it, it feels almost like present tense. Yes. You know what I mean? Whereas when you write about a film, even if you've just watched it in the past, even if it's like half an hour or an hour or 2 hours ago. Whereas I don't know how you find it, but when I'm editing, because, you know, often you sort of change it as it's going and you readapt things on the fly as you're watching stuff. And it feels like a slightly different engagement with the film in question or the filmmaker or whatever that kind of feels very now. And yeah, for me too, a lot more fun. So I sort of share your kind of enthusiasm, and I'm a big advocate for it. So I do, you know, courses sort of introducing it to people at film schools, and, you know, hopefully with some other journalists that I think we both know in the future. And I think people are interested. It's not that, you know, I think there's often a fear factor of like, oh, the technical equipment and how do I do it? But I think just to get people, you know, start watching them, and maybe then if they're interested, see how they might get on with it. And I think what you guys do with the Inside Cinema is great, because I guess a lot of our colleagues who haven't made anything yet, they would write something and voice it, and that's the first step, maybe for them to sort of move towards that. And I don't, I mean, you know, obviously far better than me, how the people feel about that, you know, if it's their first time, and how they feel about seeing that stuff rather than just, you know, a beautifully and very well written piece. This is different, and in my opinion, in a really positive way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So tell me then a little bit about, obviously I've got to ask you about your sort of own relationship with the horror genre. Are you a horror fan, Leigh, and sort of how diehard a horror fan are you?
I mean, I am. And I say that, you know, there's an element of surprise in my voice, because I didn't think I realised I was until I really thought about it, you know, because I never subscribed to Fangoria, you know, I've not been, you know, front row at Fright Fest or any of that kind of stuff. And I never sort of defined it. You know, I guess a lot of people that you've spoken to, horror is a big thing in there. You know, they make it a very clear part of that's what they're interested in. And I think I just love so many genres and so many different styles that I'd never sort of pin it down. But when I actually look at films that I, you know, rewatch and that mean something to me and do something, you know, that takes me on a sort of journey, horror is so often at the forefront of that. And it's interesting. I think if I had one genre, because it's the thing I do a bit of programming and teaching on, is comedy. And I think weirdly, they're kind of two sides of one coin, because it's that visceral reaction in the moment. How does it affect you then? And then often can give you really interesting stuff to think about afterwards. And even my comedic taste, I would say, is quite dark and quite, you know, I like a lot of black comedy. And so horror, again, bleeds into that weirdly. And so anything that's kind of quite dark and unsettling and thought-provoking, I'm totally all in for. So as much as, you know, and I certainly haven't seen every, you know, video nasty and, you know, extreme horror and things, but I've seen, you know, a lot of horror, and I think the older I get, I appreciate it a lot more, what it's doing, because it can tackle so many interesting issues in a kind of fantastical way, but then really speaks to what's going on in the world or things that we all fear or think about. And you know, the best stuff is the best stuff out there. You know, some of the best films ever. You know,
and you're so right about the comedy link as well. I think, you know, both of these genres share a lot. They both are often kind of slightly sneered upon by a lot of like award ceremonies, for example,
absolutely,
and critics, and classically they are sort of the most popular genres amongst audiences. And also I think a good joke and a good scare, they both rely on timing, right? I think there's something very similar there, you know.
I think I mean, that's definitely one of the connections. And, you know, and the other thing that I think that, and this is my big thing with comedy, which I'm a huge fan of, is it's so taken for granted. You know, it's like, oh, it's easy to make, you know, and like it never gets recognised, that awards and brilliant comedic performances almost never get the awards attention or Oscars that, you know, someone playing someone with a disability or an accent or whatever would get. And it's like, you don't appreciate how good this stuff and how hard this stuff is to pull off. And I think it's exactly the same with horror. You know, the best horror movies are doing something, you know, the balance there of the timing and giving you something to think about, and, you know, making you do your pants when you're sitting in the cinema. That's not easy, you know, that's really hard. And I think, they need a bit more appreciation. And obviously what you're doing with this podcast is one of those great things. It's like, that's, people really can get their teeth into it and really understand what's going on. And yes, sorry, long answer. Yes, I am horrified.
I love it. Do you remember what your first sort of foray into the horror genre was? Do you remember your first scary movie experience?
I do, because it was such a mistake and probably scarred my life. So, I mean, long story short, I was a kid. We were living in the Middle East, and basically some older siblings of friends of ours got a pirate Betamax. This is how long ago this is. Tape. Friday the 13th, Part 2. Not the first one, Part 2.
Amazing.
And we all sat down like as a bunch of kids and put it on, like dark room, just the light of the TV screen. And I'd never seen anything like it. And I absolutely slayed, man. I didn't sleep for about God knows how many nights. And, I think I can even say this on Evolution of Horror. That's not necessarily a classic of the genre.
No.
But it did its bit on, 10 or 9-year-old me or whatever. And I was completely traumatized. But then going on to a slightly more, better example, I think when I first, and I think this is probably still one of the most scary things I've ever seen. It still gives me chills. It's something you'll know very well. Twin Peaks, the TV show, when they revealed who Bob was, in the mirror, and who it is and what that meant for that show, because it wasn't just even a murder mystery anymore. It was like a serious story about horrendous child abuse. And I mean, Lynch is probably my, I think he's the master. It's something that he does in his films that no other film director on such a consistent basis unsettles me like him. And I know many people feel that as way too, but there's something about his exploration of our fears and this sort of dream state, and it puts you into this almost trance-like thing. And so I would say, again, I know this is an interesting discussion about what is horror, what is a horror movie, but so many of his films have gotten to me like very few other filmmakers.
And I love that. And I love that kind of stuff that sort of lives on the fringe of horror, that belongs in the sort of margins. And I think that's what we're going to talk about tonight, right? Because I think a lot of people would argue these aren't horror, and I think that's perfectly valid. But I think there's enough stuff in here that is pretty traumatic. So I'm really excited to talk about these two films. So let me begin. Before we dig into these two movies, let me ask you a little bit about Darren Aronofsky in general. I mean, we've never really spoken about Darren Aronofsky on this podcast before. He is a really interesting filmmaker. Let me just first of all ask you a little bit, if there's anyone out there that just doesn't know this guy, who he is, what he does, how would you, Leigh, sort of describe a typical Darren Aronofsky film, do you think? Okay,
I mean, the thing about Darren Aronofsky is, and I think he's one of these guys who is happy if you love or hate his films. He commits. They are confrontational, intense films. I mean, I know that this is in sort of mind and body sort of season that you're doing, and I think he's actually a really good example of that, because what he seems to love to do, and he's only made 7 features, but there's so many connections across those films, and they're usually about a sort of super obsessive driven central protagonist, or in one of the films we're going to talk about a bunch of them, who is almost like by their obsession and their drive sort of self-destruct. So it all starts in the mind, but actually all of these films and all these characters seem to end up really, in a bad way physically as well. So he kind of brings the body horror stuff in there as well. I mean, he's a really interesting guy because he sort of came up in that batch of filmmakers who came up sort of late 90s, early 2000s, who kind of came up in the indie scene and then just basically took over Hollywood. So, Fincher, Nolan, the two Andersons, Del Toro, all of whom kind of started in genre and then took those movies in their own sort of unique ways. And I think he really fits into that. I mean, what's really interesting to me is, and this is just from a sort of video essay perspective, whenever you see there's so many, throw a virtual stick and you'll hit a Wes Anderson video or a Christopher Nolan video. I've done them myself. Well, not Wes Anderson, but Chris Nolan. And yet he doesn't seem to have that fan love and devotion that some of the, I mean, he certainly has appreciators, and I think some of his films people really do love. But you know how you, like Paul Thomas Anderson or David Fincher, you just know there's absolute devotees to their almost anything they do. And I think with Aronofsky, because he sort of switches it around a bit more, and because maybe they're just so intense, it kind of can be a bit off-putting to some people. So he's highly regarded. I mean, don't get me wrong, he won, a Golden Lion at Venice, and he won a Sundance Directors Award, and, his films have won Oscars and been up for Oscars. So it's not like he's under the radar, but he doesn't seem to have that same sort of fan, level of fandom that some of these other guys do, which is interesting because a lot of these are genre films and sort of popular films with big stars, and yet, and they're and often very highly regarded and often really good films. But there's something about him that kind of doesn't sort of connect in the same, devotional way.
Yeah, you're
with some of these
right.
other guys. But that's nothing to speak against the films, because I'm a fan of his. I would watch anything he makes. Some I like more than others, and he's always going for it. Do you know what I mean? There's no half-assed Darren Aronofsky.
Exactly.
I actually had the good fortune to interview him once. I think it was for The Wrestler, and. I've got a quote. I dug up the interview because I knew we were going to talk about this. And there's a quote. This is what he said to me at the time. He said, "There are people who love it." He's talking about his films. There are people who love it and people who hate it, and that's how I think decisive work should be. Blah is the worst thing that can happen, and when it does, take me off the field and fucking shoot me. And I think that's a pretty apt summation of how he works. It's like, you may hate it, you may love it, but you will react to it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
That's so true. It reminds me a little bit of somebody like Lars von Trier in that way, where like all of his films will in some way get a reaction out of me. Some of his films I absolutely love. Some of them I hate and find infuriating. And but I will go and watch everything he makes. It's like for me it's like, oh, it's a new Aronofsky film, therefore it's, for me, that's an event. You know? But you're right, maybe he doesn't, I don't think he's quite a sort of household name director in the same way that Tarantino or Wes Anderson are, or Paul Thomas Anderson, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think honestly, he probably quite likes that. Do you know what I mean? I think he's got that quite sort of pugnation. He's, he wants to provoke, and I think if too many people liked him, then he'd probably feel he was doing something wrong. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
He wants to get under your skin. And I think he's very happy if people don't like something he's done. But I think whatever he makes, that he's given it, he's gone for it, in every way, pushing it visually, orally, with the sound, the performances, the effects. And I kind of admire that. It's like, go big or go home.
Do you think he has, like, for example, with somebody like Wes Anderson, it's like you can very much kind of sum up their style, can't you? Do you think he has a sort of similar style in all of his films? Could you spot an Aronofsky scene, or are his films kind of too eclectic for that, would you say? I
think subject matter wise, they're very eclectic. Even though, like I said, he has these obsessive characters, they're in very different guises and often different, almost genres. But, if you look at the films, because I did watch, most of them again before this chat, there's a lot of repeated sort of trademarks. Yeah. He has certain things. And there are certain things he repeats in one or two or three films, but not necessarily every film. It's not almost like, I don't know, Steadicam, Stanley Kubrick or whatever. He's mixing things up. But I think there's a certain sort of intensity and weird, and there are certain shots, like he likes the sort of overhead revolving shots that pull out, a bit like Gaspar Noé, and he does a lot of these kind of fade outs to white, where it's almost like things overcome the character and it's almost like a transcendent moment, or they kind of lose consciousness. And so there are, you could go through and you could do a little checklist of certain tropes that reoccur. But I think because the subjects kind of shift around, like, The Wrestler, you can't really compare to Requiem for a Dream, and The Fountain you can't really compare to Mother.
No,
but there are similarities, and there are themes and sort of ideas that are in there. But I think he does adapt to different types of film.
Yes,
like Mother, which I know we're not going to chat about now. There's three types of shot in that film only. Yeah, one is what she sees, one is over her shoulder, and one is her close up, and that's the entire film. Yeah. Whereas that doesn't work for The Fountain, so he doesn't do that. So he's a very smart filmmaker, I think. So he's maybe less identifiable in a sort of like every film, but there are, like I say, there are some sort of very clear connections amongst them.
Yeah, absolutely. So with all that in mind, let's begin. We're going to start with a deep dive discussion of Darren Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream from 2000.
Purple in the morning, blue in the afternoon, Orange in the evening. Just like that. 1, 2, 3, 4.
I mean, plot synopsis is pretty easy for this one. Like, elevator pitch is 4 New Yorkers, varying ages, succumb to their various addictions and descend into a spiral of despair and degradation and just, the worst. I mean, if it's an elevator pitch, it's the elevator. I think it's the elevator from Angel Heart. It's like straight to hell.
Yes.
No stops. All of these people are just going down. And obviously, a more detailed thing is it's 4 New Yorkers. There's a sort of aging widow called Sarah Goldfarb, and it's her and her son, her grown son Harry, and his girlfriend Marion, and his best friend, who's a guy called Tyrone. And they all basically have different addictions. The 3 younger people, it's more the sort of similar drug stuff. With Sarah, she's basically a lonely widow, and she's obsessed with the TV, and she's obsessed with getting on a TV show, and she feels she needs to lose weight to do that, to fit into this red dress she used to wear. So she gets hooked on diet pills. But the connection amongst all 4 characters is how their specific addictions and weaknesses just pull them down until they're unable to get out. And as I'm sure we're going to talk about, it ends pretty badly for everyone concerned.
God, it really, really does. So, this is a big, heavy film to discuss, isn't it, Leigh? Where do we even start? Let me start off by just asking you, what do you think of this film? Do you like it?
I mean, yeah. Do you, if to say do you like this film is a tricky one. I mean, I think it's a brilliant film.
Yeah.
I think it's brilliant, but absolutely harrowing. And this is like, in your face, take no prisoners. It's like a bruising experience to watch this film. But I think it's a pretty amazing kind of marriage of style and substance. And I mean, this is a very, I don't know about best directed or whatever when it comes to wars, but this is like the most directed film you can imagine, because he throws everything at you, every type of technique, but actually I think in service of the effect he's going after, which is to give you the sense of these characters when they get lost and also when they get high from their various drugs. So it's like immersive filmmaking.
It is.
In every sense. It's trying to kind of, visually and orally, and just with the pacing and the speed and all the different, styles. I mean, you could do an amazing sort of Requiem bingo, like every different type of technique. It's like slow motion, fast motion, locked off camera. He does the camera where it fixes to the character's chest, like, Scorsese did in Mean Streets. I think he calls it a snorri cam. I'm not really sure what that means, but it's like, so they move around and they're sort of like as if they're drunk and it's sort of attached to their front. The frame vibrates. There's a fisheye lens. I mean, you name it, it's in this film. And, I think for some people it probably could be gratuitous, but I think he's just doing everything he can to try and put you inside these people's very tormented heads, basically.
Exactly. I think, from the very beginning of this film, I mean, the opening scene, before even the credits, the first thing we see, we get that sort of those flashes of images from that game show. And then we're introduced to our 2 main characters, Sarah Goldfarb and her son, Harry.
Jesus, what are you trying to do? You trying to get me to break my own mother's set? Or break the radiator? And maybe blow up the whole house, Ma? Is that what you're trying to do? Your own son, your own flesh and blood, Ma? Is that what you're trying to do? Your own son? Why you always gotta play games with my head, for Christ's sake?
Harold, I wouldn't do that. The chain isn't for you. It's for the robbers.
Even the way that these characters are introduced and this film is introduced is kind of confusing and slightly jarring. The way that we've got the sort of split screen, we're not quite able to get an exact idea of space and who is where in relation to who. And straight away, the style is just hitting you. And then the way that opening scene ends with that slam, that almost jump scare as we go into the credits. It is intense, it is jarring, it is, in a way, it kind of feels like this whole film feels like a bit of an attack on the senses.
It's exactly that. It's an attack. No, it's exactly that. It's an assault on your senses. I mean, I read somewhere, and I it's not that I've checked this out, but I read this in an article, that the average 100-minute movie has 600 to 700 cuts. Apparently, Requiem for a Dream has 2,000 plus.
Oh my god!
Cuts. And obviously a lot of those come in those little montages that we probably talk about. But the interesting thing is, it's not all super fast.
No.
He varies it and controls it brilliantly, because there are some extended scenes. Like there's an amazing scene, sort of, I guess probably midway through, between Ellen Burstyn, who plays Sarah, and Jared Leto, who plays Harry, her son. And it's about 10 minutes long, and it's just a conversation over their kitchen table where she basically for the first time reveals just how lonely she is and why she's doing this stuff.
Why should I even make the bed or wash the dishes? I do them. But why should I? I'm alone. Your father's gone. You're gone. I got no one to care for. What have I got, Harry?
It's an amazing performance that she gives anyway, but it just slows everything down, and you don't feel like, oh, hang on, I've been taken out of the movie now. It works perfectly.
It does.
Contrasted to those really hyper scenes earlier, or the speeded up stuff later on. And I think it is easy to think of it as a gimmick movie, and to be fair, he sets himself up for that because he throws in so much stuff. But I think what you also have to recognize is the way it varies and how he controls that shift. And that to me is like the mark of a really great filmmaker, because I think he also said, like, the worst insult you could give him is if you called him like an MTV movie director.
Yeah.
Right. And obviously a lot of those techniques are very music video inspired, or maybe used after they were inspired by his film. But I guess the difference is he's talking about some very serious and dark issues and doing it in a really, sort of intense way. So I guess that's the opposite to what a lot of people would think of as sort of, just flashy and surface or whatever. I mean, it has that, but it has more.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just style over substance, is it, I think? I mean, that scene you were talking about, that scene between Sarah Goldfarb and her son, I just makes me weep watching it, and I think for me the thing that works most about this film is Ellen Burstyn and her character, the just sort of emotional tragedy of this poor lonely widow who kind of unintentionally really becomes this drug addict. I think with the other three, as sad as it is what happens to those three, you kind of feel like, well, they sort of know what they're getting into, whereas with her it's completely unintentional, really. It's this horrible tragedy.
Yeah, it's a byproduct of the desperation that she has for feeling lonely and unwanted. And like this TV show is like her, as she sees it, is like her one shot at salvation, or of getting people to like her or to be somebody or whatever. And so you're absolutely right. She kind of falls into this trap of these pills. I don't know how much, Ellen Burstyn is one of these actresses who maybe doesn't get enough credit because I think she's primarily in the US a stage actress, and she's made movies regularly, and she won an Oscar for her Martin Scorsese film in the 70s, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, but she hasn't got this massive ongoing track record like, Meryl Streep or some of the other big names. But this performance, I really think, is one of the great performances of the last 20 years. Agreed. She did get an Oscar nomination. I mean, not that they are the be-all and end-all by any means, but you know what I mean, in terms of recognition in a wider sense. She got an Oscar nomination for it. It was the only one, actually, that the film got, which is kind of crazy when you think about the editing and the music and the everything else going on. But anyway, she got on, and she lost to Julia Roberts playing Erin Brockovich, which is about as Julia Roberts a star performance, and it's great.
Yeah, it is
as you can get. And it's like, which of these two is going to win an Oscar? Julia Roberts doing her, megawatt smile, standing up for, underdogs, or Ellen Burstyn breaking down in like graphic close up for 2 hours. But I think, like I said, Erin Brockovich is great, but I think Ellen Burstyn's performance in this is just phenomenal.
It's just
and
devastating.
It's really, it just kills you. It's like, it's so tragic. And, you know, she puts herself through it. You know, I think she had to wear a big fat suit early on when, you know, before the character loses weight. And just the emotional depths that she sort of plumbs. It's pretty incredible stuff.
I like thinking about the red dress and the television and you and your father. Now when I get the sun, I smile.
It's such a harrowing film. It's so funny, actually, because, you know, I've sort of mentioned on social media that we're covering it on the podcast, and you know, the people that listen to this podcast, who are probably most of them pretty hardened horror fans, have all sort of said, "Oh my God, that film, I've watched it once and can never sit through it a second time." You know, it's really a film that genuinely sort of traumatized a lot of people, I think. Why do you think that is? I mean, what is it about this film that sort of packs such a punch?
I mean, it's 2 words: the ending.
Yeah, oh my God. Oh my God.
I mean, the last 10 minutes or whatever it is, I didn't time it because I was probably too traumatized, even when I watched it again just for this. It's like this symphony, because he basically cross-cuts between the 4 people as they hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
And terrible things happen to all of them, and he just keeps it just builds and builds and builds. The music builds, the cutting gets faster, the despair and the degradation gets worse. And it just wrings you out, and it just ends like that. And what's really, I hadn't realised until I rewatched it just the other day, the end credits then happen and there's no music, because it's almost like he needs you to you just need a breath.
Yes.
And it just the credits go up and it's just like the sort of sounds of Coney Island Beach.
Yes.
Because it's almost like, I can't take any more, please just let me out.
Yeah.
And so I think that is a big part of it. I mean, there's some horrendous stuff and really intense stuff that happens before, but I think because endings of films are so important to our sort of takeaway from them, and this is just it like punishes you.
Yeah, it does.
Like, for the last 10-15 minutes until you literally want it to stop.
Yeah.
I mean, a bit like the characters. I mean, we can spoil this, right? So, you know, so Harry loses his arm, Tyrone's in prison, you know, going through withdrawal symptoms and is probably going to get beaten up and things.
Yeah.
Sarah has electroshock therapy and is basically left like a drooling vegetable in a mental hospital.
Yeah.
And Marion has basically prostituted herself and is, you know, put in this horrendous scene, which I think anyone who's seen it just can't forget, where she's on a stage and forced to perform with other women, and there's these leering, you know, men in suits chucking money at them, and it's just, I mean, I won't, you know.
Oh my God. It just makes you need a shower, doesn't it? It's
It's just horrendous. And it's interesting because, you know, like, is it a horror film or not? That's all of that stuff is horrific.
It is.
It's absolutely horrific to watch. And you know, he puts the camera so close to their faces as well. Mm-hmm. So you just aren't spared anything from it.
Yeah.
And I really do think that's why so many people go, oh yeah, I love that, but I'm not watching it again.
Yeah, totally. I think you're right. It's just relentless, isn't it? And what do you think then? Let's rewind back a minute. I mean, we're, like you say, we're introduced to these 4 characters. We'll come back maybe to Sarah Goldfarb, but what about these other 3? Jared Leto, of course, playing Harry, and then we've got Jennifer Connelly playing his girlfriend Marion, and Marlon Wayans playing his friend Tyrone. What do you think of these 3 and these 3 characters and the sort of the journey that they go on, I suppose? Because I'm always kind of a little bit back and forth about them, about whether or not, they don't quite get as fleshed out maybe as Sarah Goldfarb does. And I don't know whether I necessarily have that emotional connection towards, for example, Tyrone and Marion as I do Sarah and her son, you know?
I think you're right. I think there's 2 elements there. One is Ellen Burstyn basically blows everyone else off the screen. And it's not like she's trying to sort of upstage people. She's just so good that when you're not with her, you almost want to be with her. And that's not necessarily because the other stories are not interesting or the other characters aren't or the actors aren't good. It's just she literally is so... You're just captivated by her. Yeah. I think the second thing, and you sort of mentioned this already, there's a really interesting thing, and this is in the book as well. These guys, the younger characters, are kind of, you know, complicit in their own downfalls a lot more. And it's really interesting because like Marion actually, obviously, I mean, you never see this, but she obviously comes from a wealthy family who've set her up with a flat and a shrink. And, you know, she's thinking, shall I go to fashion? Shall I start a boutique? You know, this is not like someone on the breadline who's got an addiction because they've got nothing else. So it kind of feels, I mean, you don't want to be judgmental and go, well, you deserve it, because it's so horrible that no one deserves that. But there is a complicity in all of these guys. Harry, you know, you see this photo at his mum's house of him in his little graduate, you know, mortar, you know, the cap and the gown and stuff. Yeah. You don't get so much about Tyrone, Marlon Wayans' character, and you get a sense he probably is from a much more impoverished background. Yes. But he's probably the least fleshed out character, and that does kind of detract a little bit from his storyline, I think, which is a shame. The actors are fine. I mean, I'm not the biggest Jared Leto fan in general. No. But, you know, he's giving it his all. I think Jennifer Connelly is really good. She does that. She's got that brilliant thing because she looks so sort of classy and so beautiful. When she sort of goes to these really dark places, you can sort of see the self-disgust and self-loathing that she goes through. So I think the two women slightly overshadow the two men amongst those four characters, and that does sort of imbalance the film a little bit, I guess. But I think the style sort of, because he's so good at making sure that, you know, he does the same stylistic stuff for everybody, you know, the little montages and things, that he kind of binds it all together. But I think you're right, you kind of end up almost wanting more. I could have watched a film about Sarah Goldfarb, to be honest. Yeah. And that would have been fun.
But I love that it does, in a way, I suppose, kind of nail the different types of addiction, but also different types of personalities, I guess. The sort of, I guess Sarah Goldfarb is, in a way, a kind of extreme, tragic version of your sort of high-functioning, slightly more middle-class person who does take kind of diet pills or does this or does that, but may be actually more addicted. You know, it may be more dangerous than it appears. And then you've got the kind of young, trendy, arty, white liberal kids, again, quite middle-class, kind of taking drugs because it's cool and because they're in that world in New York and that kind of thing. And then, like you say, maybe somebody else who's slightly more impoverished and maybe, you know, is in this situation for other reasons that's a little bit less in their control. Yeah, sure. Again, we don't really know enough about Tyrone to necessarily know that, but I think that there's something there, isn't there, where it's kind of in some ways giving you a spectrum of you might be able to sort of associate with, in some ways, one of these four characters, you know, whether it's the older lady or whether it's the young guy. Or, you know, I think that there is an attempt, I suppose, with those four characters to kind of give you the spread of the different types of addicts that you can get, I guess. Yeah,
I think, I mean, you're totally right. And I mean, it comes from the book initially as well. But it is that. It's exactly that. You know, I think, you know, it's really interesting. Directors, when they do movies about this, they seem to be really resistant to saying, I didn't want to make an anti-drugs movie. You know, it's like anyone who comes out of watching this film and wants to do drugs, I would seriously question their motivations in life. But basically, exactly that, because they're all different characters, different backgrounds, different ages even. It's this general thing. It's like, you know, if you watch something like Trainspotting, which is another great film about, you know, drug use, they're similar guys on the same drug. Yes. And so it's like someone could be very judgmental about that world and go, well, I would never be part of that. You know, look at those, you know. Whereas because they come from different backgrounds and, you know, diet pills versus weed versus coke versus heroin. Yeah. It does give you a sense. And I think that's what he's after. When he says he's doesn't want to make an anti-drug movie, it's not about, because then we think of drugs as in, you know, deals on the street and that kind of stuff. Yeah. And it's almost like the drug of being addicted to trying to get over your weaknesses and your loneliness and your personal despair. And I think that's what he's hitting at. And so, you know, Hubert Selby Jr.'s book, and then obviously, and, you know, he apparently Aronofsky was in love with that book because they both come from the same area, this sort of Brighton Beach in Coney Island in Brooklyn. And I think it really resonated with him, you know, so presumably he's seen these different types of stories around him. And then, you know, he sort of thought, right, I'm going to make that into a film. And yeah, it's exactly that. It's showing addiction rather than a specific drug.
it's interesting. I mean, one of the things I've talked about already on this podcast is the idea of drug movies, and that is, you know, there's a lot of bad drug movies out there, right? I mean, filmmakers that just make everything go maybe a bit psychedelic and a bit weird. If any character, it's like when directors do dream sequences but badly, you know, and it's like just make everything go a bit crazy. Do you think that, you know, Aronofsky does portray, because actually Trainspotting is a really good example, I think, of like, I've never done heroin, but I can almost imagine what it is like based on watching Trainspotting, right? And what it's like coming down from it as well.
Sure.
And do you think Darren Aronofsky does a good job with that in Requiem for a Dream, putting the idea of the experience of drugs, I suppose, into a film?
Yeah, so I think the very specific, I mean, like I said, he does all these techniques, but very specifically, he does what he calls these hip-hop montages, which are these like super fast, super short cuts of microscopic close-up images, so, you know, like a depression of a syringe, pupil dilating, a lighter flaring up, with really exaggerated sound effects, like samples.
Yes. People would, I think a lot of people would now say that's quite an Edgar Wright thing, don't you think?
Well, I mean,
I wonder
Edgar Wright does that for like comedic purposes brilliantly.
Yes.
The drinks in World's End or whatever like that. I mean, I guess this film is a few years before Shaun of the Dead, but and he's not the first person to do super fast cutting. You know, there's directors who've done rapid edits, you know, like in the 1920s, like Albert Gans and stuff. But I think to use it for that drug, you know, he does it very specific for those moments where they score and then they sort of take a hit. And it gives you, I guess he's trying to give you that sort of like rapid fire, sort of like high. And then he does the montage, and then it usually cuts to them sort of, you know, either looking a bit glazed or sort of like suddenly up again. Yeah. You know, from their previous depressed thing. So I think he's really trying to give you that sense of this is what it's like. So I guess, you know, when I'm slightly mocking him for saying I didn't make an anti-drugs movie, because I guess he's also, what he would probably say is he's trying to show you why they take it. Yeah. You know, they wouldn't do it if it didn't give them this absolute sense of euphoria and well-being and like, I can take on the world and all of that kind of stuff. And I think he does that, but obviously there's a lot more of the downward trajectory in this movie. So I think that's true, and I think it is important that we understand and we sympathise with why they're doing what they're doing too, right? And I think the film does a really good job of that. You know, that these people are not a million miles away from being us, so they are dealing with all kinds of very human problems. Jared Leto. Yeah. There's that scene when Jared Leto has just had that devastating encounter with his mum, which we've already talked about. He's in the cab on the way home. He starts crying. Then there's that quick montage of him doing drugs, and then suddenly his face has changed in the space of a couple of seconds. He's no longer crying. He's looking a bit more mellow. And there's that moment when Marion is looking in the mirror at herself. Maybe there are some self-esteem issues. She shoots up, and then she looks happy and she looks comfortable with her own body. And I think, again, what they do is they do a really good job of kind of, with very quick editing and slick filmmaking, explaining exactly why these people do what they do and the effect that it has on them, you know? So I think, and I think all of that's super important, because I think we need to understand how and why these characters got into the situation that they're in. Yeah, and I mean, the saddest one for me is, you know, right at the end of that really, you know, the horrendous ending thing, the last shot of Marion, so she's done this awful stuff, you know, performance for these leering men, and she's got home and she curls up on the sofa, but she's like cradling her bag of drugs, and it's almost like it's worth it, effectively, is what she's feeling at that moment, because she's just got a new hit. And that's the really terrifying thing about that thing, because the other people end up pretty much like, oh my god, my life's shit, but she's like, yeah, okay. I'm going to do another, you know, performance next week if I get this. And I think that, you know, by just making that as one of the ending scenes is really important, because it's not just like, you see, they all now rue the error of their ways. It's like, no, she is fully addicted, and she will go to those depths if it gets her that high. And that's really terrifying, you know, for anyone who sort of has encountered addiction or, you know, been involved in it or whatever. It's like, I'm sure that's a hugely recognizable feeling. And it's pretty scary because, you know, people often relapse, right? Not because they don't want to get off, it's because it's so hard.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're so right. And you get the feeling with her, it's just going to carry on, right? It's just that was just another day for her.
Yeah.
And that in itself is just as terrifying and just as devastating as an ending, isn't it? That's the thing. Because you would hope that at the end of Sarah Goldfarb's story there, that maybe that's the end for her. Maybe at some point now she's going to start to get help. Who knows? You know, that's what I like to think at the end of that. But with Marion, yeah, you just think, well, that's it. It's ongoing for her.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think? Now, obviously, we've put this film in a sort of horror podcast context.
Yeah.
To what extent is this a horror film, do you think?
You see, this is such an interesting question to me because I have the same thing about comedy. You know, what is something a comedy if you laugh or whatever? So I guess for me, and you know, everyone's mileage is different. I would say it's not a horror film, but it's horrific. And actually, there are a lot of films that have some of the films that have disturbed me the most that I wouldn't at all or necessarily call horror films. Like, I don't know, you know, is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest a horror movie, given what happens to Jack Nicholson? You know, is Old Boy a horror movie, given what, you know, the revelations of that? And I think this fits into that bracket where genre-wise, in terms of, you know, a lot of the things that you might identify with the horror genre are not necessarily there, but the overall feeling, and I think, you know, especially because it denies you any sort of catharsis or uplift at the end. It's just like, as I said, elevator straight to hell for everyone involved. Yeah. So that is horrific. But I mean, I'm interested what you think on that, because this whole horror versus something horrifying is a really interesting discussion to me, because I don't have a clear answer. I feel for this, I wouldn't class. If someone said to me, "Is it a horror film?" I'd say it's absolutely traumatizing, but I wouldn't describe it in that sort of horror thing. But I could understand if someone said, "Too right, this is a horror film. I've never seen anything more depressing in my life."
Yeah, it's really interesting. I kind of agree with you. Of course, you can't call this a traditional horror film. Of course, you can't. However, like you say, it is horrific. It's as traumatizing as sitting through some sort of torture porn film. You know, it's like it's as visceral as sitting through Hostel or Martyrs or something in some ways. But also, I found it really interesting because there are, I think, a couple of moments that do feel like pure horror to me. I think that there is one set piece in particular where Sarah Goldfarb is being basically attacked by her fridge. Right, which actually I think is shot and lit and scored and edited as a horror film scene, don't you think?
Absolutely.
The watching TV, hearing the rumble, the close-ups of fear as she's looking around her flat reminds me a little bit of maybe something like Roman Polanski's Repulsion or something. Oh,
I should have jumped in. I was just about to say that because no, I watched that the other day, and you know, there's a scene in Repulsion where the wall opens up in the same way like a mouth, and Catherine Deneuve is there, and it's like close up on her, and then the wall kind of splits horizontally like a mouth. Yes. And I thought that is exactly, I didn't know if it, I mean, it may even be a deliberate homage that he's doing there, but no, you're absolutely right. There are a couple of scenes in there, and you could even argue maybe even the ending, where it's absolutely film grammar wise, and also just lighting and sound and stuff, it is putting you in that horror area. So I would, you know, like I said, this is just my personal reaction to it, that I wouldn't necessarily class it like that, but I think you could absolutely make a case in the opposite way. Yeah. And that is, I mean, I think you nailed it with that scene. That is exactly that thing, because it's, you know, her look, and there's a couple of scenes as well where she's in a doctor's ward and it's shot with a fisheye lens and she's looking completely terrified, and that's very much like, you know, horror movies where the final girl or whatever is sort of trying to evade the monster or the killer and is like looking around and it might jump out at them and stuff. So for sure he's playing with some of those tropes. I just think overall, because there's so much else going on there, I didn't think of it, I didn't want to sort of narrow it down in that way, but for sure there are sequences in there that are absolutely in that sort of horror vein.
What seems to be the problem? The weight's doing fine.
The weight's fine. I'm not. The refrigerator.
Is something wrong?
Everything's all mixed up.
And I think you're right, what you said at the very beginning of this chat, that his films dabble in both this idea of sort of the mind and the body, and that those scenes, you know, like the fridge scene, is like something out of a pure psychological horror film, like Repulsion, where most of the horror kind of is taking place inside a character's mind, really. And then, of course, like you said, it descends into out-and-out body horror. I mean, you know, a guy sticking a syringe into a wound in his arm is one of the most painful things I've ever... Like, I still, to this day, I have to look away from the screen at the moment when he puts the syringe back in it.
And the makeup on his arm looks so horrendous. The black and it's just like his arm is rotting. It's just like, you know, it probably would have fallen off anyway if they hadn't amputated it. My God, it's just horrendous. So I think there is also that element of, like, you know, a few years later, again, like I say, these are the sorts of images that you would see in a lot of what people now call torture porn films. Right. You know, that's the thing. So it does. I think it's massively influential.
It strikes a really interesting balance.
Yeah, I think it's a really influential film for like dramas and, you know, other genres, because there's so much in there. And he, you know, I think he doesn't necessarily maybe even get the credit that he probably deserves for just going for all these different effects and actually making them work. Because I think, you know, there are obviously a lot of filmmakers who kind of do very look at me style, and it's not always in service of the story. And I think because this is about addiction, and because this is about, you know, repetition, so, you know, those montages, they keep popping up because they keep taking these drugs, and it becomes this sort of ritual type thing. And the split screen, and we didn't talk about that. I mean, the way that these characters, there's a brilliant scene where Jared Leto and Jennifer Connelly are sort of lying together, like sort of caressing each other. And he does it as a split screen, which is such a brilliant visual depiction of how, even though they're next to each other physically and they feel that they're connecting, there's already this divide between them that is actually going to completely split them apart. And I just thought, what a brilliant kind of simple but such an effective way to visualize that. Because again, split screen, you see it a lot, and it's actually an effect I'm really interested in and want to do something on myself. But it can be just so cheesy, you know, like telephone calls and stuff. But to do it like when actually the people are next to each other, that's so clever.
Yeah, you're right. And actually that's the one thing, thinking about it, that does tend to reoccur in Aronofsky's work. This idea that every character is in their own little bubble. It's like every character is sort of isolated. It's like you've got these close-ups of these characters' faces and then other stuff happening around them, you know. Like you talked about, kind of strapping the camera to them or separating them in a split screen by themselves. Of course, Black Swan and The Wrestler and Mother, to an even greater extent, have that feeling of that one character is always on screen and the camera's kind of keeping them enclosed in this little sort of bubble, right? Absolutely. And I guess in some ways that is happening with these four characters in this. They are, even when they interact with each other, they're all in their own little bubble of hell, aren't they, as well? That's the thing. The last thing I want to ask you about, which we haven't really mentioned yet, I mean, is the music, right? I mean, I think that how much has that score, that Clint Mansell score, been used in everything? It's been used in everything from kind of like reality TV shows to other films.
I feel like I want to hum it as you're talking now. I just want to start going...
It's so good. What do you think of that score?
No, it's iconic. I mean, it's one of those things. And again, doing a little bit of reading about the film, because he's talking about these hip-hop montages, apparently Aronofsky's original idea for the music was a kind of more hip-hop based score, a bit like he did with Pi, which is, you know, has a lot of connections actually. His first film has these montages, has a very urban hip-hop score, and then apparently Clint Mansell brought him this piece. I don't think it was necessarily Luxor Turner, but, you know, some other music. And he was like blown away by it. And so then they really went after that, and then they got the Kronos Quartet in to sort of play it. And it's just, I mean, it's one of those pieces of music that you hear it once and you go, yeah, that's a keeper. You know, it's just, you know that's going to be forever in adverts, trailers, sports montages, you know, because it could be despair, it could be triumph, it could be suspense, it could be, you know, it does everything. It's
one of the great scores now. Like, you almost can't believe that it's actually as recent as 2000. It feels like it could have been something from 50 years ago, you know, like it feels like it belongs in the pantheon of great film scores, like something Bernard Herrmann would do or whatever, you know.
Yeah, and what's amazing is how quickly it started getting not ripped off but used. Like, I think the next year or 2 years later, Lord of the Rings, I think the Two Towers did a kind of choral version for their trailer.
Yes.
And that's like, you know, a massive, Lord of the Rings doesn't need Requiem for a Dream score, but it's like, I love that score, I'm going to put it on my trailer. I think Danny Boyle did it with Sunshine. I mean, there's a bunch of people who obviously were like, it's so good, I'm just going to, you know, use it. And, you know, and I mean, actually, I think Clint Mansell's done some, because Aronofsky repeatedly, you know, he works regularly with same cinematographer, same production designer, same composer, and actually Clint Mansell's done some amazing stuff with him. I actually think the score for The Fountain is maybe even better than the Requiem for a Dream one.
Well, I think that the score for The Fountain is better than the film. I mean, I find The Fountain probably one of the most insufferable films I've ever sat through. Wow. But I have listened to the soundtrack more times than I can count. It's a beautiful soundtrack. It's absolutely wonderful, isn't it? I know The Fountain is it divides people. I mean, one of my best friends, I went to see it with him. He thinks it's like the greatest film ever made. It
might be my favourite Aronofsky film, actually.
Oh, there you go. For me, I almost, like, my eyes couldn't roll back far enough for me.
No, so I get it. And I think he would be thrilled to hear both of these reactions.
No, totally. And actually, I was talking to a friend today about Mother, and I really liked Mother. It really had an impact on me. And again, I was talking to somebody who was like, ugh, it just, like, they said, you know, they had to do everything in their power not to walk out of the cinema. They found it so insufferable. So they go, you're right, his films do evoke these reactions out of people, don't they?
And you know, like I said, you wouldn't have it any other way. I mean, I think if you're gonna go for these big things, some people are going to go with you and some people are going to go, nah. Exactly.
So there you go. Let's wrap up there and we'll move on to Black Swan in a minute. But final question for you. You know, this film's 20 years old now. It is kind of its time. How do you think Requiem for a Dream holds up, and would you still recommend it to new audiences?
I mean, I would recommend with a massive trigger warning about for various things. Double-edged dildos include. I mean, there's too much that you can warn people about in that film. But no, I think it's held up really well. I mean, I say about The Fountain, I think this and The Fountain are probably the films that I would, and The Wrestler as well, maybe, are the ones that I value the most. And I think it's just, you know, this is only his second feature, and I think to go for something as bold as this, and, you know, go so big stylistically, but really actually connect it to the material. It's not just a guy showing off and going, hey, look, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. Yeah. He's really pulled it down to this story. And, you know, apparently, you know, Pi made a big splash and he could have, you know, loads of people wanted to work with him. He's like, I want to do this. And they looked at the book and they're like, no, and the script, and almost no one wanted to make it. And he stuck to his guns and, you know, he pulled it off, in my opinion. So I think it holds up really well. I mean, you know, I could understand that maybe people who've seen so many of these effects in other contexts since, maybe if they haven't seen this, come to it and go, yeah, it's that old stuff. But actually a lot of that is, this film has influenced other things rather than vice versa.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like going back now to watch an early Tarantino film and being like, well, I've seen that a million times. But it's like, yeah.
Exactly.
No, you're right. And I think it's very easy, it could have very easily been a total failure, this film. And it could have been an example of music video style and no substance, right? But I think most importantly, this film has a heart. It is a film that makes me cry. It is a film that makes me devastated. And that's that's why it works, I think, and that's why it will always work.
I agree.
So there you go. Before we move on to our next film, let's move over to our new regular segment, Wild About Horror. And let's hear what Freudian cinephile Mary Wilde has to say about Requiem for a Dream. I've got a feeling she's going to be quite a big fan. Let's find out.
Hey Mike, Mary Wilde reporting again, back to my Freudian shenanigans. Excited to be contributing to Darren Aronofsky Week, one of my all-time favorite directors whose filmography I've researched extensively for various lecture series. Let me start by offering some of my thoughts on Requiem for a Dream, a harrowing plunge into the terror of substance abuse that invariably elicits strong negative reactions from audiences. This is a film that captures the way drugs can dislocate us from ourselves, showing the psychopathology of being a junkie. What would compel someone to inject a needle full of heroin into an arm conquered by necrosis? This is a shot from the infamous winter sequence of Requiem, which Aronofsky claims sums up the whole film. It shows us how far people go to feed their addictions. Eventually, Harry's arm gets cut off for his drugs, but still he pursues the very thing that destroys him. The Harry, Tyrone, Marion story is a very traditional heroine story, but putting it side by side with Sarah's tale, we start to question what a drug is. The idea that the same inner monologue goes through a person's head when they're trying to quit drugs, as with cigarettes, as when they're on the diet. This was the real object of fascination for Aronofsky. In this segment, I want to focus on the women in this story. Let's first consider Marion, darkly portrayed by Jennifer Connelly. It's established from the outset that her parents finance her lifestyle, but the connection with them is shallow and distant. Their relationship is transactional. They throw money at Marion so that she'll stay away. This is the tragedy of Marion's character. All of her interactions as an adult replicate an underlying monetary exchange instilled by her parents. Her parents bankroll sessions with a therapist who is aware of Marion's issues, but exploits her anyway. He takes advantage of her sexually, and she sleeps with him to barter for drug money. Once Marion's situation reaches a point of desperation, we see her completely trapped in a life of unwitting prostitution, exchanging her body to access hard drugs. She's unconsciously recreated the very pattern of the relationship with her parents: contractual, conditional, free market, business-based, laissez-faire economics. As I would say to my Projections podcast co-host Sarah, Marion is the perfect neoliberal subject. The writing was on the wall in the run-up to her depraved final scene in the film. The severe loss of parental attachment serves to establish Marion's identification with an abandoned object. It's a loss that causes her further injury to her self-regard. Addiction functions to exacerbate her feelings of inferiority. Addiction confirms what her nihilistic heart already suspected. She's alone. Aronofsky uses split screen extensively in the film, along with extremely tight close-ups to capture the inner turmoil she experiences. Long tracking shots, including several with the Snoracam, a camera strapped to the actor's body, and time-lapse photography are also prominent stylistic devices that give us relentless access to Marion's suffering. What Aronofsky is doing with these techniques is subjectivizing emotion. The camera is a vehicle for exploring the character's mental state, hallucinations, visual distortions, distorted sense of self, and corrupted sense of time. Now let's move on to Sarah. Her son Harry's drug addiction leads him to repeatedly steal and sell off her only source of comfort, her television. But she appeases his behavior because he's her only child. Sarah diets to once again fit into the notorious red dress, the one she used to wear when her life was filled with meaning, when her husband Seymour was alive. Sarah becomes convinced that she will be appearing on television. It sparks a wave of delusions about how her problems will magically be resolved once she is celebrated on a TV show. Television here is a signifier onto which a multitude of meanings coalesce, transforming the shame of being a junkie into a spectacle of triumph. The TV set being an item ritualistically sold by Harry and bought back by Sarah renders what in psychoanalysis is called cathexis, the concentration of mental energy on one particular idea or object. Requiem for a Dream fulfills another theoretical construct, that of the repetition compulsion. Initially, Freud believed that human beings are motivated purely by obtaining pleasure, but later he came to understand that the urge to repeat our past, however tedious or traumatic, is an even stronger impulse than the desire to feel good. In this case, the subject repeats repressed material as a contemporary experience, finding exposure again and again to a painful situation, although the origins of the compulsion are forgotten. In the context of drug addiction, indulging in a pattern of downward spiraling behaviors enables the person to temporarily escape. The repeated procedure of obtaining, preparing, and abusing substances becomes a source of dissociation from a pre-existing pain or trauma. This is also linked to a state of jouissance, an excessive pleasure related to the division and splitting of the subject. The addict transgresses prohibitions imposed on their enjoyment. The result is not more pleasure, but pain, since there's only a certain amount of contentment that the individual can bear at one time. Beyond this limit, pleasure turns into an extreme discomfort, so jouissance is understood as suffering, the domain of the death drive, which is manifested in the compulsion to repeat. Desire can never be satisfied. No relief is to be found. The subject goes on obsessively wanting more in a never-ending cycle of consumption believed to be the path to wholeness. Requiem for a Dream accurately depicts this hellish state of deadlock and delusion. Summer, fall, winter, but no spring. Only destruction, no rebirth for junkies. Till next time.
A big thank you there to the brilliant Mary Wilde, and we will hear again from Mary later on in this episode, so stay tuned. When were you sort of introduced into horror? I mean, for you personally, were you kind of introduced to your dad's movies at a very young age?
The only one that I watched as a kid was what I think looking back on it was probably a TV edit of Fast Company, because I don't remember the nudity in it, and it was on a Betamax tape in a drawer somewhere. So I think that was sort of the closest thing to a film I could watch as a kid.
Now, that was a little snippet you just heard there from my discussion with none other than Brandon Cronenberg. Yes, I got to sit down and chat to the legend of modern Canadian body horror about his new film Possessor and what it's like to be the son of the king of body horror himself, David Cronenberg. The brilliant Possessor is finally out in the UK for anyone to see. It's on digital platforms from the 27th of November onwards. So if you're UK based and you haven't yet seen Possessor, oh my god, check it out. And it's such a perfect fit for this current series of the podcast, the Mind and Body series. Brandon Cronenberg is, I think, very, very special, and he is of course kind of following in the footsteps of what his dad did so well in the 80s, but I think he's also adding a really new, interesting twist as well. And yeah, I absolutely love Possessor. It's one of my favourite films of the year. So be sure to check it out. We will, of course, be discussing Possessor in depth in our Mind and Body series. It will be the very last film we discuss. So right at the end of our series, we're going to wrap up with Possessor. But if you want to hear my discussion with Brandon Cronenberg from now, then you can over on Patreon. It's available for donors of $5 and upwards right now. So sign up and head on over to patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to our Darren Aronofsky discussion as we jump 10 years after Requiem for a Dream to discuss the one and only Black Swan.
I had the craziest dream last night about a girl who was turned into a swan, but her prince falls for the wrong girl and she kills herself. He promised to feature me more this season.
Well, he should. You've been there long enough. And you're the most dedicated dancer in the company.
Our new Swan Queen, the exquisite Nina Sayers.
I'm Lily. You're gonna be amazing.
Watch the way she moves. Sensual. She's not faking it.
Seduce us! Attack it! Attack it! Come on!
Where'd you get these?
It's nothing.
You sweet girl.
Feel my touch. Respond to it.
Someone's hot for teacher. I don't want to talk about that.
You really need to relax.
It's the role, isn't it? It's all this pressure. I knew it'd be too much. I knew it.
Ow. What's she doing here? He made me your alternate.
The only person standing in your way is you.
Okay, a little bit more storyline involved with this one. So basically, it's about a young ballerina called Nina Sayers. I guess she's in her 20s and she's at a prestigious New York dance company. She's very desperate to get the new lead role in their big production, which is going to be Swan Lake. And she lives with her mother. She seems a little bit kind of very vulnerable, let's say. She's not a confident young woman. And she basically does get the role. She sort of has to kind of beg a little bit to the artistic director, a guy called Thomas, played by Vincent Cassell, who's this kind of Svengali type figure who kind of, manipulates everybody and is slightly, actually incredibly dodgy with everyone. But she gets the role, and his basic pitch to her is she's a great dancer. She could do so. For people who don't know Swan Lake, they often have the same dancer playing the white swan, which is the kind of virginal, innocent, lovely woman, and the black swan, which is the kind of lustful, evil twin. And he basically says to Nina, you can nail the white swan, but what have you got in you to become the black swan? And so it's basically her journey to try and achieve this. But as she does so, because she's so sort of vulnerable and fragile, she basically starts to sort of break down psychologically and start to think that people are against her, something's going wrong. She starts sort of hallucinating. There's a new girl in the company, Lily, played by Mila Kunis, who seems very friendly, but Nina starts to believe is maybe out to sort of sabotage her. And she basically gets taken over by these sort of visions that something's going wrong, or she's being sort of turned against herself. And, sort of spoiler alert, at the end, she sort of completely loses it and has, kind of gone a bit, I don't know what the right word would be, if you call it insane or whatever, but she's gone down a very dark journey mentally, and so she sort of loses herself, and basically she completes the dance, but she's maybe fatally injured herself, or done herself in at the same time. So it kind of ends again in that sort of Aronofsky tradition of someone sort of obsessively going after something and then, mentally and physically falling apart in the process.
Oh, God, exactly. So it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we talked about how Aronofsky's previous films, Requiem for a Dream, obviously it did get an Oscar nomination. It was getting critic recognition, but it wasn't the big sort of mainstream crowd-pleasing success that I think Black Swan is. Black Swan feels like his first film that really pushed over into the mainstream. It was a big box office success, wasn't it? I think this film really kind of made him a recognisable name and brand in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it did very, very well commercially. I mean, it made like $300 million or something, and the budget was fairly tiny. So in that sense, it did. I would say that The Wrestler 2 years earlier made a fairly big splash because, it was Mickey Rourke's comeback and he nearly won the Oscar as well. So I think that sort of 1-2 within a couple of years really sort of propelled him into the sort of like top rank of kind of American auteurs. But yeah, for sure, Black Swan made a much bigger splash. And actually, Rourke was nominated. Actually, Natalie Portman won. And I think Aronofsky got a nomination for director and best picture. So, it was definitely a step up even on The Wrestler. And yeah, it was one of those, and I think it won, did it win? I can't remember if this or The Wrestler won the Golden Lion at Venice. But anyway, it basically got a lot of critical acclaim as well as doing well financially. So it kind of, I think after about a decade since Requiem for a Dream, where it'd been a bit hit and miss, The Fountain hadn't done very well, it'd taken a long time for him to make. Wrestler was sort of a step up. This was sort of like, right, now he's at the place, now he's at sort of Fincher, Anderson, Nolan level type thing.
Yeah, exactly. So with all that being said, what do you think of Black Swan? Are you a fan?
I enjoy it, and it's a lot of fun. Really weirdly, I find it very hard to take it too seriously in the way that I really invest in the emotional journeys of so many of the other characters and so many of the other of his movies. There's a slightly camp and kind of, a bit over the top, and that's crazy to say about Aronofsky given that it's always so in your face, but there's elements to this that kind of keep me distant from the character's emotional journey. I mean, it's so well made and it's so well acted by Natalie Portman, and again, he's doing all his brilliant stuff visually and orally, the sound effects, and again, really, I mean, we probably talk about this more, but the body horror stuff is so small but so unpleasant, and how he does that with sound as well in images. So I think it's super well made. It just doesn't get to me. It feels a little bit schematic. It's almost like after you've watched it once, other than just appreciating the filmmaking, I don't know what more I get from it. Whereas things like Mother and The Fountain and Requiem, I can watch them again and get different things from them. This one, it's like, it feels to me, and maybe I'm not doing it justice, a fairly straightforward tale of a vulnerable young woman going a bit bonkers, and that's it, and there's not much more to it. And once you know what's going to happen, apart from appreciating the filmmaking, it doesn't get to me in the way that some of the others do. And I know a lot of people have a very different experience, and really, this gets to them in the way that some of the other films get to me. But this one, I don't know, it just feels a little bit hermetic and schematic to me. It doesn't it's just like, it does exactly what I sort of expect it to do. And I think with his other films, like, I had no idea where they're going. I had no idea where The Fountain was going. I had no idea where Mother was going. And this one, it was kind of like, I kind of feel I know what's coming with this.
Yeah.
But it's really well done, and it's a lot of fun. Yeah, it's fun. I think it's my favourite Aronofsky film. But he's giving a cheer. He's giving a quiet cheer. It's like, you see, this is what I want.
I can't disagree with everything you just said about it, though. It is what it is, and I think I was predisposed to love this the most because it's the most out and out bonkers high camp genre film that he's made.
Yes,
like, it is. We could debate forever about whether Requiem for a Dream is a horror film, but this, I think, is pretty solidly a horror film. I think that he's
for sure.
I think that he's taking from Giallo to Brian De Palma to obviously again Repulsion. That there are so. I mean, this is a class. It's got jump scares. It's got body horror. Yeah. It's so over the top. I love it. I love everything about it. Honestly, like it makes me kind of smile with glee every time I watch it. And I think it's kind of perfect. Like, I think for what this film sets out to do, for what Darren Aronofsky is making here, I think it's pretty much his perfect film. I mean, maybe, and like you said, maybe in some ways it's too perfect. It's very neat. Its themes are all laid out very clearly. Its performances are exquisite. Everything wraps up in a bow at the end very neatly. There's not a lot of room for ambiguity. I totally know what you mean. I've not got my heart being ripped out of my chest in the way that I have with Requiem for a Dream. Mm-hmm. I've not got that level of anxiety to the point where I want to crawl out of my own skin like I do with Mother. But I find this film by far the most enjoyable thing he's ever made. Right. I just and it's the film that I can just easily go back to and watch and enjoy because it's kind of campy fun, and I kind of love that for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, this is so fun. I can't disagree with anything that you said because it's so much fun. But what I would say to that is all those influences that you mentioned, De Palma and, Polanski and what else? I mean, even a bit of Lynch and, you could argue the sort of Mulholland Drive thing of the, split thing.
Yeah.
I think is better done elsewhere. Like Mulholland Drive and Repulsion and even Sisters, the De Palma film.
Yes.
And also the other film, in terms of influences, I don't know if you know the Satoshi Kon animation film, Perfect Blue, which is, again, about a young... She's actually a sort of pop star, and she gets a sort of doppelganger who kind of haunts her and hunts her down and stuff. Yeah. And I just feel that I've seen this story or this type of story and this kind of psychological breakdown elsewhere more done in a way that got me more emotionally involved, which doesn't take away, and I'm not saying he's ripping off these other films or anything, because he puts his own spin on it, and the way he shoots the ballet and stuff is beautiful and not traditionally how ballet is shot on film, but it just felt like this is the first one that felt like I feel like one of the joys for me of Aronofsky stuff is I don't know what's coming. And this one felt like I kind of got a fair idea, not every step of the way, obviously, but it just felt a bit more like, this is familiar. And it's really well done, but I'd seen other stuff that got to me more.
And I think that's probably following a deliberate formula. It's like watching... Of course, I suppose it's like watching a tragic ballet, isn't it? It is like watching, it's very theatrical, it's very over the top, it's very operatic, and we are seeing this tragedy of this girl, her descent into madness and to ultimately to death. It's almost this kind of Shakespearean or Greek tragedy playing out, isn't it? And it is done in that very, very intense operatic style throughout, I think. Which means that there is absolutely no subtlety whatsoever.
No, but I mean, he's not a subtle filmmaker in general, I would say, which is a good thing in a lot of ways. I mean, I guess the one thing I like about it is it will get a lot of people in to see a horror film who maybe wouldn't think they would want to see a horror film. Do you know what I mean? It's that sort of horrible, elevated horror idea because it's Natalie Portman and the ballet. And, this is the sort of film I could pitch to my parents to go and see.
Yes.
Where they would not ever consider going to see a horror film. It's a bit like Silence of the Lambs. If I say Jodie Foster's an FBI agent on the trail of a killer, I might go and see that. But that's gruesome, and that's a horror film in a lot of ways. And Black Swan is a bit similar. It's like, it's a psychological thriller about a young ballet dancer and stuff. It's like, but it's a horror film. And I think that's a good thing.
It's a full-on schlocky. It's a schlocky horror. I mean, also Barbara Hershey. It's like she's been plucked from like Mummy Dearest or Whatever Happened to Baby Jane or something.
You know what? That was one of the things that, because I do think one of the weaknesses for me of this is the supporting characters, and I wanted full Carrie's mum from her. Do you know what I mean? I wanted I don't want her just to threaten to throw away a cake. I want her like pinning Natalie Portman to the, tying her up with her ballet ribbons. And I felt like I mean, they obviously, it's a passive aggressive, oppressive relationship with her mum, and she infantilizes her, and she's got the bedroom like of a 7-year-old girl and all that kind of stuff. But it almost felt like they could have done more with that. And so that, again, little things like that where I was like, I mean, it's good, and Barbara Hershey's fine, and it works, but it's almost like, I think if then I want the full Carrie, operatic, mother, absolute, insanity thing going on. But again, it's a stupid thing to kind of say what you want rather than what's there. Do you know what I mean? That's the story, and that's what they did. But I just felt like that would have been something I would have appreciated, and I think it would have fitted in actually with the sort of operatic craziness of the basics.
It would have, totally. So, what do you think of the way that this film is directed, especially in comparison to Requiem for a Dream? I suppose of course, 10 years have passed. We've lost all of that. Extreme editing, I suppose. We've kind of lost most of that sort of music video hip hop style for this film, haven't we? And it's feels a little bit more organic to me in a way, which again I kind of love, in a way that I don't so much notice the camera work or editing in the same way. A lot of it feels just kind of like handheld, and we're sort of following Natalie Portman as she steps onto the subway and as she's dancing and she's rehearsing, and up close and personal as she's kind of like fixing her shoes and scratching them. And I kind of what do you think of sort of the way this film, I suppose, looks?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really well done because I think he's adapting against the material. Like a Requiem for a Dream approach here, I don't think would have made sense, and that would have been the wrong fit, even though it's about a character who's sort of losing it mentally and is kind of, seeing things and hallucinations and stuff. And I love all the stuff he does with mirrors and, and it's like, you look in the mirror and it's her, and then the camera pans and it's Mila Kunis's face and all that kind of mirror reflection looks back at her and all this. So he is kind of doing some kind of cool visual effects and kind of showy stuff, but in the service of the story. So it's a lot more dialed down. And that handheld thing, I think, if you go to 2 years prior, The Wrestler, I think he was a big fan of the Dardenne brothers, the Belgian guys who do those sort of very social realist films, the Kid on the Bike and Rosetta and stuff, where they often just follow someone behind, and the camera sort of handheld, literally just walking behind somebody. And I think he was really struck by that. So that you get a lot of that in The Wrestler, which is a much more sort of street level film. And I think he kind of really cleverly connects that with the main character in this, but because it's full on genre stuff, he adds in the little flourishes of all the kind of, horror stuff and the jump scare and the kind of, she's looking there and then the mirror's twisted over there and all that kind of stabbing the Winona Ryder stabbing herself in the face suddenly. The subtle stuff. So I think he's so good. I think this is why he's actually maybe a bit underrated as a director, because I think he adapts to the material. It's still his film and he still imprints his sort of personality on it, or he tackles similar stories that he's interested in, but he does think of how it would best serve the material. Do you know what I mean? And so you get the dance scenes are really great. All that stuff on the stage where the camera is almost like a dance partner to the ballerina or to the dancers, and it pirouettes around them, and it's really smooth and really slick. So I think it's really, really well done. This is what I mean. I think I've been a bit negative about it, but it's a supremely well made film. And all of those shots are just beautifully calibrated, and he's not stupid. He knows that this is an actor's film, and he just keeps the camera so close on Natalie Portman, and she does a great job. And it's it's another of his movies where he's like, this is my star. I am going to absolutely, capture every nuance and every little flicker of emotion, like with Mickey Rourke, like with Jennifer Lawrence, like with Ellen Burstyn, Hugh Jackman to a degree in Fountain. This is what he does. He frames them very symmetrically. He usually has them at extreme close up. And I guess actors really respond to that because they all give these really intense, great performances, and she's really good. I mean, as much as I'm saying I didn't connect to it emotionally, that's maybe my failing. It's not because she's not really excellent. And he's not filming her really well.
It's a big performance, isn't it? As Oscar-winning performances so often are. It's it's often like people's joke, don't they? It's like Oscar. It's not always the best actor as much as it is like the most acting, or like the best editing so much as it is the most editing, and that kind of thing. But I do think she's brilliant, and I it's less the big crazy stuff as much as it's the nuances on her face. It's the extreme close-ups when she's processing about 800 emotions all at once, I think, that I really love about her performance in this.
I had the craziest dream last night. I was dancing the White Swan. It was different choreography, though. It was more like the Bolshois. It was the prologue, when Rothbard cast his spell.
Well, I think also, I mean, again, I'm speaking for Natalie Portman, which is a bit out of order, but I would imagine, or I can imagine, that she almost saw this role reflecting what she wanted to do, because people saw her, especially if you saw her as a kid growing up, in Leon and then the Star Wars movies and stuff, as a bit of a sweet, innocent, kind of likeable thing. And I almost think that this White Swan, Black Swan thing is her own challenge.
Yeah.
That she was trying to break out a little bit, because she has some scenes that are quite full on, right? She has a masturbation scene, she has a sort of sex scene.
Yeah.
She has scenes where she's really, physically in distress and, attacking people, which is not what she'd traditionally done until that point. And so I wonder, without the insanity, obviously, there's some sort of parallels there with her career of like, right, I'm going to take this role because this is going to give me a chance.
Yeah, you're so
to
right.
show a completely other side. And it's really interesting because, the Vincent Cassell character is like, yeah, we know you can do the sweet, lovely, innocent girl, but can you do this? And it's almost like Natalie Portman saying, you know what? Yes, I can do that.
Yeah.
And I'm going to win an Oscar and show you exactly how I can do that.
Yeah, you're so right. It's actually it's very clever casting actually, because they're all playing to their strengths. I think Vincent Cassell, who I've just. Oh
my god, I love Vincent Cassell, but some of the lines he has to do.
Oh my god,
one line. What is it? I've written. Hang on. He says something like, "I've got some homework for you. Go home and touch yourself. Live a little," or something like that. And it's like, wow. I mean, I'm not saying the character wouldn't say that, but it's like, okay. And he also kind of spells it out every turn. He's like, you've got to lose yourself in the performance.
Yeah,
you can't just be this perfect little thing. And it's like, yeah, I got that.
Yeah, it's so funny. I love him. He I recently just watched him in another film which I think contends with Requiem for a Dream as the most unpleasant thing to sit through, which was Gaspar Noé's Irreversible. Right? I mean, again, speaking of like a film that is basically just an attack. That film was it's like God, but he is good. He seems so perfect for this, and actually,
no, he's got that arrogance. I think there's something about him. I mean, I really like him as an actor. And he can do all sorts. But he's got that sort of that stance.
He does,
of just sort of like commanding and like quite sneery and quite sort of superior and quite sexy. You know what I mean? It's all out there. So it's really good cast. I mean, I would argue the character's a bit lame because it doesn't go much beyond that, but he gives it his all.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And he's the right person to do that role. It would have been nice if there'd been a little bit of a twist or something else going on with him. But I guess...
Do you know what I was thinking is maybe in some ways a better version of this relationship that I've seen? Probably my favourite film of the last 10 years maybe is Damien Chazelle's Whiplash. And that teacher-student almost abuse and this like artist's strive for perfection that basically destroys him by the end. It feels like they're quite similar in a lot of ways in terms of the trajectory and that story, right?
That's such a good parallel. I mean, yeah, and actually, the character that J.K. Simmons plays in that, he is a bastard, but there's other stuff going on there.
Yeah.
And I guess, I think this is the interesting thing when you do these films with like a sort of central character and it's basically tried to be filtered through their subjectivity, you can kind of get away with a lot because it's like, are these characters like that, or is that her just projection of her mum, her dance rival, her thing? Maybe he was a really cool guy, but all we see is her thing, that he's just this sleazy Lothario guy who's kind of trying to seduce her and is really arrogant. And I guess that's a kind of good get out you always have when you do these films that are just this is this is through this person's perspective. But it almost feels like a little bit of not a cheat, but it would have been interesting to see a bit more shade and stuff around that character. And I think, like I said, same with the mother, even same with the Lily character, Mila Kunis's character, who actually, she brings a lot of personality and, she's really lively and really spontaneous. Everything that, Nina, Natalie Portman's character, supposedly isn't. But again, she just stays in that one sort of zone. And so, I don't know. But then maybe that's just Nina's projection of everyone, and that's why we're seeing it.
Yeah, I think I think you're totally right. And again, I reckon it's probably deliberate. I think there is this feeling of that they are like chorus members in some weird way, or they are like kind of theatrical supporting players, all of these people, and they are a little bit two-dimensional in some regards. And I can't help but think Aronofsky has kind of really pushed that deliberately in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, he's such a smart filmmaker that it would be absolutely, understandable if he said, that's what I'm doing, but that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Because that's her story, and that's how she sees all these people. And that's fair enough. I think these are just some of the little elements that made me connect with it a little bit less, because whereas in some of the other films, there's a lot more going on with some of the supporting characters, this one felt like, they're just doing their job for her psychological reason to like them, fear them, push back against them, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. What about this idea of like the double, I suppose? I mean, it feels like something we've seen forever in cinema, I suppose, in a way, right? And of course, we've already talked in this discussion about movies like Mulholland Drive, which does that so cleverly. Of course, Ingmar Bergman's Persona. I feel like you always at some point need to go back to Persona and reference that with these kind of things.
Genius film, yeah.
It is genius, isn't it? And I feel like Aronofsky is deliberately harking back to some of these films. There are clear homages, I think, in Black Swan to some of these greats. But what do you think of the idea of the double in this, I suppose? And Mila Kunis, I think, is terrific in this as the kind of anti-Natalie Portman, right? As the anti-Nina. Me knowing nothing about ballet, and this is what Aronofsky does so well. He is such a visceral filmmaker, and I think in the same way that he puts across cinematically that idea of what it feels like to be on drugs or to be on a come down from drugs in Requiem for a Dream, in Black Swan, I feel like I know exactly how this kind of stuff works with ballet and what works and what doesn't and what's good and what isn't, and I've got no fucking idea, but I feel like the film does such a good job of portraying it. The pain and the anguish and the beauty of ballet. And I think that idea that Mila Kunis is this much more free, kind of free spirit, I suppose. She's not perfect in the same way that Nina is technically, but she's natural and she's such a pleasure to watch. But how do you think these two characters play off each other, and how do you think the doubles are handled here?
I don't know. I think the thing with some of those other movies that you describe, Mulholland Drive, it's a sort of twist, if you haven't seen it before, of what's going on with those characters. So you think it's one thing, and then it turns out to be another. With Persona, there's this really fascinating sort of like melding of the two women, sort of halfway or two-thirds of the way through, that you weren't expecting. And I think it's almost no fault of its own, but because it's set up the way it is, you know that eventually she's going to sort of find the black swan in her, and that's going to sort of torment her. And I mean, it's maybe a bit unfair to sort of critique it like that, but I guess because I expected that to come, whereas some of these other films, they took me by surprise the first time in a way that was really like shocking and really made me like either quite, upset or really emotional about it. And this, I guess, because also of the camp stuff. I mean, even little things like, just casting Winona Ryder as the sort of faded, ballerina on her way out. Another beautiful petite brunette who in Hollywood terms at the time was like, it's like there's so many winks going on outside of the movie.
Totally.
That it kind of took me a little bit out of the story. And actually, Aronofsky doesn't normally do that.
Yeah.
For me, he keeps, like I believe Mickey Rourke was that guy, even though I know a lot of crazy Mickey Rourke stories. Yeah. Or, I know that he was going out with Jennifer Lawrence when he was making Mother, which is a whole podcast in itself, I'm sure. But I bought her as that character because of the thing. So I don't know, there's just something about this film that, as much as I think it's so well done, I'm detached from it in a way that I'm not with the majority of his work.
Is it true, just as an aside, that the first wife that you see burning at the beginning of Mother is Rachel Weisz, who was Darren Aronofsky's previous wife?
No, is that true? Well, I don't know. I'll have to go. I'm going to go and watch it again after this.
Go and watch it again. I've only seen the film the once, and I need to revisit it. But I've been told by a bunch of people that you don't see her face in full, but it apparently looks identical. And if it's not Rachel Weisz, it's like he's cast somebody to make them look as much like Rachel Weisz as possible, which is so fun. So he does love to do that. He does love to do that.
I so hope that's true. That would be amazing. No, because I mean, Mother is a whole thing about the artist's drive to create and the destruction it puts in its path, and I'm sure he's kind of connected a little bit to that in his own way. So that would be amazing. So
funny. And again, you can't help but think Aronofsky, as good as he is, I bet he can be a right arrogant dick at times. And there are moments, of course, in the Javier Bardem character in Mother, but also probably in the Vincent Cassell character in Black Swan as well. I can't help but think, I wonder if there's a bit of Aronofsky in there.
I would absolutely imagine that's the case. I mean, as I said, you meet these people for like half an hour in a press thing, so you can't pretend that you really know them or whatever, but you have had an interaction with them. And my feeling is he knows he's good.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Do you know what I mean? He's a very confident guy, and I think he's probably a very driven guy. You know, to get the sort of films he makes get made. You know, a lot of them are not easy sells. And I think he is probably quite a tough character to live in. I mean, that's maybe unfair, but that was my impression, and also based off the work. So, but then at least if he's interrogating that a little bit, then fair play to him. You know, it's like, you know, he's honest. He's holding up his hand like, you know, I will burn these women to death to make a film.
It's true. I think all
metaphorically, I should say.
And all of that stuff is interesting, and it's again, like I mentioned earlier, there is something similar to Lars von Trier, I think, in that kind of like, I can see why people would be absolutely exhausted and not want to give some of these things the time of day, because they do feel a bit indulgent. But I kind of love it. I kind of love that he is maybe sort of working through some of those processes, you know, in his movies.
Yeah, and I think the fact that he changes, you know, it's like he hasn't just kept doing another Requiem for a Dream, you know, and another Pi. He's branched out. I mean, you know, you don't go from, I think the film he did after this is Noah, which is this biblical epic, which is, I mean, that is a trip. I mean, again, love it or hate it, to make a Bible story with like Lord of the Rings style creatures in it. I mean, you know, he's got balls. I mean, he really has. He doesn't take the safe option. And I love that. It's like, I would never have expected that in a film called Noah about, you know, the ark and the flood.
Yeah.
So... And there's some, I mean, again, the film is a bit of a mixed bag, but there's some amazing scenes in that, like a creation sort of montage thing.
Oh,
and it's like,
it's my favourite,
just really, you know, that's an uncommon filmmaker. Do you know what I mean? That's someone who knows what they're doing and is prepared to sort of put their money where their mouth is, because I think Noah was, you know, it didn't please, like, that had a massive potential core audience of hardcore Christians in America, and they hated it because it completely destroyed the Old Testament. And a lot of other people didn't like it either, but he's like, he knows that going in, and he's like, this is what I want to do. And, you know, for me, you have to admire.
I love it. I love that he never plays it safe.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me ask you then. I've got to ask you about the body horror in this, right? So we talked so much about the sort of the horror of the mind in this and in Requiem for a Dream, but this film is positively Cronenbergian, I think, in the way that Nina literally starts transforming into a swan, doesn't she? How do you find that sort of body horror, and particularly in this film?
I mean, it's interesting. The early stuff, which is more realistic, is the most hard to take. You know, like, I think it's the like the second scene. So the first scene, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the very first scene is this kind of dream ballet that she has. And then the next scene is she gets out of bed and she just clicks her toes. And it's like, oh, that's awful.
Yeah.
You know, because it like, you know, these, you know, if you only know ballet through movies, you would think it's only for sadomasochists, because it's always about, you know, they get so injured and they're, you know, bashed around and stuff. And so she's obviously, you know, bearing the brunt of all this training and stuff. And then obviously the thing with the nail. So those are the bits that, again, make me really wince. I mean, later on, the more extreme stuff, when she basically gets webbed toes and swan legs and stuff. I mean, again, I can appreciate, it's fun. That's what I mean when I say it's a fun movie. Yeah. It's like, but, you know, of course that's going to happen. I mean, I'm glad she didn't go full beak and stuff. But it's really, you know, that doesn't horrify me. It's more kind of enjoyable, because it's like, yeah, that's the next step. But the early stuff with those little kind of injuries that feel very realistic and again, he's brilliant at using the sound on those. It's not just the visuals. It's like, you know, the sort of sound of the peeling of the thing and the clicking of the joints and all that really grisly stuff. So yeah, I like the fact that he's gone full on body horror, because, you know, as we've sort of talked about, so many of his characters suffer physically at the end of their sort of mental, you know, breakdowns as well. He really does marry this sort of mind and body stuff, but hers is obviously the most sort of extreme version. Or I guess Hugh Jackman in The Fountain turning into a plant. It's probably quite extreme too. But you know, it's you know, he's really going, like you said, this is an unapologetic body horror, psychological horror movie, and fair play to him. You know, he brings it. He doesn't hold back.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I've spoken time and time again on this podcast about how I can handle extreme gore, but I'm not good with like small, relatable people, like teeth coming out or fingernails coming out. I cannot deal with. And actually the the hangnail, the peeling off of the hangnail in the bathroom in this film is one of the most horrible things I've seen in any film. Like it's one of my most wince-inducing things.
It's pretty horrible. There's also that bit where she sort of pulls like a black feather out from her back, and the skin almost looks like that, you know, that sort of chicken skin where it's the little pimply stuff, and it's like, oh, so that's pretty gross too. Yeah. So I mean, this is what I mean when he goes, you know, it's like that's what he's going to do. He does it full bore, and it's really gross, and it's really unsettling and stuff. And then the later stuff, I think it's why, you know, that shot where she gets the kind of swan legs, it lasts like a second, because I think he knows that he has to do it. But it's almost like you're not going to, you know, do a lingering American Werewolf in London style close up on the transformation on that. You know, you do it because it's kind of like that's her mental state. But actually, the really gruesome stuff is the kind of fingernail and the toes and the stuff, and it's all in there, you know. And it's like I said, it's fun.
It's really fun. Yeah, it is. And I do love, and like you said, I know that this has been done in film, but I do love this kind of warts and all view of ballet, which is so, you know, thought of as one of the most kind of elegant and beautiful forms of art, I suppose, and performance art, and getting into the nitty-gritty of it and how gross it is, really. Like how you know, the clicking, the bones, the injuries, the cuts, you know, this is true, isn't it, by all accounts, that ballet, the stuff that ballet dancers have to deal with, and the real body horror that goes into ballet is quite amazing, and I kind of love that films that explore that, you know. Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, you can go back to, like, you know, the Powell and Pressburger film, The Red Shoes, and again this obsession and the dancing, and you can't stop, and it just destroys you if you want to do this art form. But it's interesting because I read some kind of not reviews, but, you know, they showed it obviously to a bunch of ballet dancers, some newspaper did, and a lot of them were like, yeah, but there's no you know, yes, of course we get injured, and yes, of course it's grueling, but there's no joy, there's no, you know, we don't do this because we're completely masochistic lunatics. And it's interesting that films just have picked up on, at least the films I've seen, I'm sure there are others out there, you know, there was a film a couple of years ago called Girl about the trans character, with ballerina, and again it was the same thing, her toes were like mashed, like as if they'd been beaten with a mallet, and it's like, oh my god, what does Hollywood or what do filmmakers have against ballet? It's like they can't ever show it. Billy Elliot's the only film I've ever seen where it's like, wow, he seems to love ballet and he's not completely twisted.
It's fun. Yeah.
So
you're so right.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess the other thing with the ballet stuff is there was the whole controversy over whether Natalie Portman was dancing or not, and this whole thing about you know, the woman who doubled for obviously a lot of the more complex stuff came out very publicly. And so I guess there's a weird thing there about, you know, this whole thing of like, we have to believe that she's doing it. And it's like, I find that really strange because I wouldn't expect Natalie Portman to be a professional ballet dancer style. I would expect that they've... But then it's like, then the film has to overcompensate and say she did 80% of those things, and you know, and then the ballerina's like, well, yes, she did, but actually the hard stuff, which is I did all of that, or you know, 90% of that. So it's almost like they're both right. Yeah. But it's almost like I suppose I mean, this is 10 years ago, but like now with deep fake, you know, technology and stuff, it almost becomes a moot point. But that doesn't detract from her performance to me. If you don't think she did all those amazing dances, it's like she's an actress. She hasn't trained for 20 years. Why would she be able to do that? Yeah. And there's this weird thing that people feel like it's always a point of pride. Like if someone does a boxing role, it's like, oh, they could have been a middleweight. It's like, really? Yeah. I mean, okay, fair enough. But, you know, it's always, you know, they played the piano for 3 years and then they could do Rachmaninoff's symphony. It's like, wow, they're really talented. I can't, you know. Yeah, exactly. There's this ridiculous need to sort of show the dedication of the actor rather than like, actually, they're cast because they could do the emotional stuff and they're brilliant at that, you know. Whereas Natalie Portman is obviously physically not a traditional ballet dancer in stature and, you know, physique and everything, but they have to sort of, you know, take it to this extra level. Sorry, I was just connecting that to the sort of body idea. Yeah, you're so right. Stuff, because it's like, I'm sure she worked her arse off for a year to train, but then that doesn't mean I expect her to, you know, I don't even know what the terms are, but you know, the massive pirouettes and stuff.
Yeah, you're so right. You're so right.
Of course you shouldn't have to do that.
There is that regular contributor on the podcast. I'm sure you probably know her, Anna Bogatskaya, who's worked at the BFI as a programmer. She came up with a great little term, a great little niche area of horror, and I keep telling her to make a video essay about it because it will make a brilliant video essay, which is dance horror, right? And of which Black Swan, Gaspar Noé's Climax, Suspiria, Luca Guadagnino's Suspiria, and there's a few other things, Andrei Zulawski's Possession, and there are a few things, right, where I think you could make a really fun, there is something of that, this kind of small area of horror that focuses on dancing.
No, it's funny, actually. I do a module at the National Film and TV School with one of the MA programs where we make video essays, and actually one of the students, or two of them actually, they did that a couple of years ago.
Did they?
You know, it was just a sort of class project type thing. But it was just as Suspiria came out, and I think the Lucas Dont film Girl had come out, and we did a few of those kind of and Climax. So it's I mean, you know, it's totally ripe for a bigger video project. So, Anna, get on it.
Get on it, Anna. So the next thing I want to ask you about, I mean, we've touched on him briefly, but Vincent Cassell's character, this horrific, leery dance teacher. And Vincent Cassell has got this amazing quality where he manages to be kind of handsome and charismatic, like you said, but also being kind of disgusting at the same time and almost villainous.
Perfection is not just about control. It's also about letting go. Surprise yourself so you can surprise the audience. Transcendence. And very few have it in them.
I think I do have it in.
Ah! You bit me? I can't believe you bit me.
You know, he was always designed to be a bit of a wrong-un, clearly, but how do you find this watching it now in 2020, post-Me Too? Do you know, has that added anything to these scenes for you?
Yeah, I mean, he's almost like a kind of, you know, big flashing neon arrow on the Vincent Cassell character of like, if you see this guy doing this stuff, talk to someone about it.
It's not okay.
He's so out of order, and there's the bit where he sort of, you know, seduces her in his office, and he there's two bits. He seduces her in his office, and he also does it sort of in the studio, and he really, you know, he starts grabbing her and everything, and then he pulls away and going, that was me seducing you. Now I want you to do the opposite. And it's like, oh, you such a prick.
Oh, he's so awful.
But he would say he's trying to draw this performance out of her, but obviously it's bollocks.
No, it's true. It's true.
But so, you know, I don't think the film... what you said is true. It doesn't judge him, but I don't think we're supposed to go away from it thinking, no, well done. He managed to get that performance out of her by grabbing her crotch.
Yeah. In some ways, you could see that he is this kind of this personification of the industry. If you look at Winona Ryder's character and how kind of damaged she is, and she was his favourite star pupil for years, right? And also you get the feeling that maybe Barbara Hirsch is basically all of these women, apart from Mila Kunis, who is the sort of newbie, who does seem to have a bit of objectivity, and she sort of says he's a sleaze. Like everyone else, you kind of get the feeling that he has in some way hurt these other women that he's kind of been, you know, wielding his power over and stuff. But it's perhaps a shame that all of the women in this film are a bit unhinged, you know. Look at Barbara Hershey, you know, Natalie Portman, Winona Ryder. They're all pretty crazy. But I think also the film is laying the groundwork for saying this is what the ballet industry, this is what working in the arts does to people, specifically to women, and this is how men treat women in this industry, men in power. And it is kind of laying, I think, most of the responsibility for the way in which all of these women have been irrevocably damaged by the industry on the men that control the industry. And in that way, I think the film was maybe a few years ahead of its time. you know? I kind of wish that side of it had been pushed a bit further. But I think the groundwork for that is all there in the same way that it is in movies like Repulsion, you know? So we're going to wrap up Black Swan shortly. Before we do, let's head back on over to Wilde About Horror and hear what Freudian cinephile Mary Wilde has to say about Black Swan.
Hey Mike, Mary Wilde reporting for Freudian Duty. Another Aronofsky title, Black Swan, which also happens to be my favorite film of all time. Trying to express my thoughts about it in a short segment is daunting as hell, because I could talk about this one for ages. What a masterpiece. This is the story of a fictional New York City ballet company putting on a production of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. Nina Sayers, played dazzlingly by Natalie Portman, is cast in the coveted lead role of Swan Queen. She embodies the innocent and disciplined white swan and is called to also channel the seductive black swan, natural qualities displayed by Lily, her alternate. Aronofsky began with an unrealized screenplay about understudies and being haunted by a double, similar to the folklore surrounding doppelgangers. Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Double was cited as a literary inspiration for Black Swan. This film depicts psychosis with high-octane intensity. The pressure to perform darker elements of herself causes Nina's grip on reality to break down. She's instructed to lose herself, abandon strict control. Perfection here is defined as letting go. Throughout the film, Nina has hallucinations of her body becoming freakishly swan-like. Of course, the original Swan Lake ballet is a very gothic tale, as it's about a woman who actually transforms into a swan. Very early on, Aronofsky thought of the project as a type of werewolf movie, a concept that motivated all the gothic overtones he eventually incorporated into the look. Kinetic techniques were used to draw the audience in. Handheld cameras closely following characters, quick-paced back-of-head shots. We come to understand Nina's physical and emotional turmoil because we're right there taking the same journey with her. Aronofsky was exposed to the world of ballet from a young age because his sister trained as a ballerina. He said that ballet is a weird art form. On stage, it's all ethereal beauty and light. Backstage, the dancers are out of breath, sweaty. It's anything but effortless, and you realize there's all this competition. And sure enough, every woman who surrounds Nina is at once her rival and her double. The suicidal formal principal dancer Beth, her sexy alternate Lily, and Nina's overbearing mother, Erica. The mother-daughter relationship in Black Swan is ambivalent. Erica simultaneously encourages and resents a success that she cannot share, so she infantilizes Nina and controls her. Artistic director Thomas becomes Aronofsky's double in a way. He pushes Nina to extreme physical and emotional limits where reality and fantasy are increasingly difficult to separate, collapsing onto each other. If Nina is to successfully embody the dual role of the black and white swans, then she must let go of the image-based conception of herself. There has to be a movement from the shallow imaginary realm to the dimensionally complex kinesthetic domain of the body. And make no mistake about it, this film is an attack on the senses. Toenails splitting, skin irritation, a blood-drenched hangnail, and the agony of feet due to the unnatural load-bearing of pointe work. Thomas warns that Nina's rigid, virginal, self-conscious identity is a limitation, and suggests that provoking the spectator's erotic desire elicits the highest state of perfection. Darker sensibilities of the Black Swan eventually emerge for Nina. She becomes obsessed with nailing her performance, pun intended, leading to an intoxicating transformation during her performance of Odile's Coda. The final sequence of the film takes on a frenetic, visceral register. I remember feeling electrified and transported when I first saw it at the cinema. and I kept going back for more. I watched Black Swan 10 times on the big screen when it first released. I was hooked. A concept that can help us understand this film is the shadow from Jungian psychology. The shadow is the unconscious part of the ego, usually disowned, forced out of sight, and it can be the seat of our unrealized potentials. The shadow is prone to psychological projection. Negative traits and perceived personal inferiority are unconsciously cast onto others to avoid an honest confrontation with the self. Nina initially finds it difficult to acknowledge her own eroticism, so it is suppressed as part of her shadow self, which is then projected onto Lily as something nefarious. What is seen as unacceptable becomes part of the shadow. It is most destructive when habitually repressed. The archetypal shadow is transpersonal, something perceived as pure or radical evil. As the reservoir for human darkness, the shadow is simultaneously the seat of creativity, making it at once a terrifying place that has the capacity to enrich our life. Coming to terms with the shadow, assimilating it into the conscious personality, is the analytical goal of Jungian psychology. I believe this is the central journey of Black Swan, an ambitious artist prepared to dive headlong into her shadow self and face her most terrifying fears in order to perfect her craft and literally stage all the different sides of herself elegantly and gracefully. Catch you on the next one.
A big thank you there to the wonderful Mary Wilde. And don't forget, if you want to hear more of Mary's takes on films and Freudian theory, she has a podcast that she co-hosts with Sarah Cleaver called the Projections Podcast. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts. And for any other information about upcoming courses and other bits and pieces that Mary has going on, follow her on Twitter at PsychStar. Okay, we're going to wrap it up here, Leigh. There's so much more we could say about Black Swan, but time is upon us. So my final question for you, I mean, you don't seem to be as big a fan of this film as you are Requiem for a Dream, but would you still recommend Black Swan to other people out there who haven't yet seen it?
I would totally recommend it because it's a really, really well-made film that totally embraces its kind of, over-the-top genre stuff and has a good performance at the middle and it's just a lot of fun. It's really interesting. It's like, what do you go to films for? I would absolutely go for this for a kind of really crazy fun night out type thing. Even though it's pretty dark. I mean, I don't want, I'm maybe doing it a disservice. It goes to some pretty bleak places if you think about the character, but it just didn't connect for me on that sort of really deep, hurtful emotional level that many of his other films have. But, it's by no means a bad, it's a really good film and it's totally worth watching if you haven't seen it. And it's a horror film.
It is. So there you go. So beyond these two films, let me just finish by asking you, for anyone out there that maybe wants to, hasn't seen the rest of Aronofsky's oeuvre and wants to kind of, where would you recommend people go next? What are your favourite Aronofsky films? Which ones would you recommend?
I mean, Requiem for a Dream is one of my favourites. It may be a bit too intense as a sort of initiation, although maybe that's what you need. It's like, if you can handle that, then, you'll be pretty fine with anything else that he throws at you. I'm a big fan of The Wrestler, which is very stripped down in sort of directorial, flourishes, I guess, compared to a lot of the things. And I know it's not your favourite, but I think The Fountain, and I don't buy every minute of it, but I think it's so ambitious and it's so kind of visual, and it makes such massive leaps between timelines and all this kind of stuff. And I was a little bit almost like in awe of its kind of chutzpah, if you like,
Yeah, totally.
And I did find it quite moving as well. I think Hugh Jackman, I think it's probably Hugh Jackman's best performance. I think he's really, really amazing in it. But I honestly think in terms of, he hasn't made a lot of features, but I don't think, apart from Noah, which is a bit of a, Marmite-y type thing, I don't think you can go wrong. I think there's something of interest and something that really, of ambition in every single one of the films. And I think so, you'll have your preferences amongst them, but I think it's crazy to think that he's not rated. I mean, he is rated, but I think he could do with a little bit more attention directed him compared to the attention that some of the other sort of big, American filmmakers of his generation get.
Yeah, I agree. I think what's really interesting about him is that everyone does have their own specific favourites. It doesn't feel like there's one film that everyone agrees is his best. Everyone does have their, there's not like Pulp Fiction with Tarantino or, There Will Be Blood or whatever. Whether this kind of like one crowning film that everyone talks about, it kind of feels like everyone will have their own favourites with Darren Aronofsky because they're all so extreme and intense in different ways. I would agree. I think The Wrestler is pretty brilliant. I love The Wrestler, and the two that we've talked about. Mother is really horrible but kind of fun and interesting as well.
I mean, that's a crazy one. I mean, that's a whole discussion in itself, isn't it? But again, I think I like the first half a lot more than the second half. But again, I can't think of anyone else who would make that film and just go for it. And I think it's very self-flagellate. I think there's a lot in there about, the terribleness of living with a crazy creator.
Yes.
And I don't think that's he's got to be talking a bit about himself in that. So I think again, just for that, it's like good.
Yeah. So there you go. Leigh, thank you so much for this. It's been so much fun to discuss these films with you. I'm just going to finish by asking you what I ask all my new guests. What's your favourite horror film?
Wow. I mean, I have a bunch. I mean, I think you can't go wrong with Psycho. I think it's just for so many reasons because it's so influential. I think what really gets me with horror is tragedy as well. Yeah. So a lot of my favourite horror movies have that real sadness to them. It's like I feel for Norman Bates, even though he's obviously just done some pretty terrible things. Yeah. Or The Fly or Rosemary's Baby. These films that really hurt you as much as they thrill you, because there's often the protagonist is a prisoner of their own sort of wishes or desires or fears, or just gets stuck in a really shitty situation, and so those kind of films are the ones that really, I guess, move me the most. In terms of recent ones, I mean, I don't know if you know, I'm sure you do because you're a horror expert, but there was a film a few years ago called The Invitation, Karen Kursava film, which that really got to me as well. There's something,
too.
You know what? There's something. In terms of what really scares me, there's something about when people seem almost happy, or they're so like fundamentalists. Where it's like they're just going to do their evil thing, and you should be okay with it. Like the end of The Wicker Man, or
Cults.
Or the one thing that absolutely freaked me out when I was younger was the nanny in The Omen.
Oh yeah,
when she's like, "This is for you, Damien," and it's like, oh my God, that's awful. She's happy that she's about to, kill herself in front of a kid's party. That kind of stuff I find really upsetting. So I think those are my sort of things. But I think if I had to name one, I mean, Psycho is just, it's a masterpiece in so many ways. And I think Anthony Perkins in that, talking about great horror performances. I mean, it's like untoppable for me.
Absolutely. Not Friday the 13th Part 2 then.
No,
fair enough.
Strangely enough. Although, it did its job on me as a 10-year-old or whatever. It did what it said on the tin. I had no idea who Jason was, but bloody hell, I knew afterwards. So,
It does the job. Amazing. Leigh, thank you so much. Just tell us before you go, where can people find you and more of your work out there online?
Okay, so I guess the main thing I use on social media is Twitter, so it's at Leigh _Singer, and there's links there to a very out-of-date website, but Vimeo stuff. My work appears, the video stuff is on Little White Lies and Sight and Sound and various other places, but the Twitter thing, I guess, is a useful sort of hub, if you like, to sort of go to other places if you're interested. Yeah.
Perfect. Leigh, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks so much. It's been really fun.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's guest, the brilliant Leigh Singer. Such a joy to have Leigh on the podcast. Hopefully he will be back again in the future. So please do get in touch. What do you think of this week's films? What are your thoughts on Darren Aronofsky as a director? Do you have a favourite movie of his? Do you agree with our takes on Black Swan and Requiem for a Dream? Please do get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's films with fellow listeners, then simply join the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. You can find all previous episodes and seasons of this podcast on our website. Head on over to evolutionofhorror.com. If you want to support this podcast and be treated to regular bonus content, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can sign up at either a $3, $5, $10 or $20 level and get different benefits for each. $5 and upwards will get you access to tons and tons of bonus episodes, including my exclusive interview with Brandon Cronenberg, which dropped this week. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Podbean, Acast, Stitcher, Libsyn, and Spotify. If you want to support this podcast but can't afford to do so financially, we would be hugely grateful if you could spare a few seconds to leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, which really helps us get discovered by new listeners. Okay then, on to next week, part 21 of our Mind and Body series. Next week is a good one. We're just discussing one film and one film only, a teen cult classic, one of my absolute favourite films growing up. I'm going to be joined by the one and only Alex Ayling, and we are going to be discussing Richard Kelly's mind-bending masterpiece, Donnie Darko from 2001. Can't wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.